from all, to all, with all, for all, through all. We thank the gods of creation. We thank the ancestors. We thank the forces of nature. And we thank the earth. We thank them for their direction, their protection, their guidance, for keeping us, showing us, allowing us to know and enjoy life to its fullest, now and later.
Black people who once loved with the slow march of time. Time was ours to hold in the soft, love-warm chambers of our hearts. And once we, the Afro mommies and daddies of a sun world, would turn our strands of hair into antennas to tune in the juju madness and syncopated love rhythms of Africa. And we loved with time, and we took the time to love, and with the right time we loved, and we loved time after time. Will we ever love again? Will we ever love again? Will we really ever love again? Or will we just sit and rot away with the brighter tomorrows in the skag field, rat-cluttered halls of our minds?
Black people, what y'all gonna do? Black people, what y'all gonna do?
Will the real black people please stand up?
Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to return to the church again. It's been quite a while, and certainly to greet some familiar faces I haven't seen in a while, and of course to be invited to share this evening with you. I'm going to talk a bit about a number of topics. There are so many things that relative to concerns, but I'll sort of focus it around what I see as a challenge to Afrocentric education, the kind of thing that you're attempting here, what kind of challenges we face. I'd like to start off by quoting from an article in the New York Times, Monday, August 31st, which I'm sure many of you, being well informed, read, but I'll just sort of repeat some of the areas. It was entitled, "Black Child's Self-View is Still Low, Study Finds." The repeating of a landmark study shows that feelings of racial inferiority among young black children are as strong now as they were 40 years ago, researchers reported yesterday. But they said black children can be helped to develop greater self-esteem through efforts by teachers, parents, and changes in the way blacks are portrayed in films and television. And it goes on to indicate about 2/3, the new studies involved asking children which doll they prefer, a black one preferred, a black one or a white one. About 2/3 of the black children preferred a white doll. Many of you, of course, will recall this is a recapitulation of the famous Kenneth Clark study. And you'll probably recall, either through your reading or in terms of your past experience, that that study was very instrumental in influencing the United States Supreme Court to rule against segregation, the famous 1954 decision. And it's interesting now, of course, and I believe that study was done in around 1948 or somewhere in the late 40s, actually. So it's interesting to see this study being replicated some 40 years later with essentially the same results. And I think when we think about it very deeply, it has some very serious implications. Of course, essentially, the results are stated in the headline: black child self-view is still low. Dr. Kenneth Clark, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the City University of New York, who along with his wife, Mamie, conducted the original study, called the findings disturbing. I find that a very interesting statement. What the children are telling us, this is Dr. Clark speaking, is that they see their color as the basis of self-rejection, he said. We try to hide the damage racism does to black children, but the damage is there and will continue as long as racism continues. I find it very interesting that Dr. Clark, whose study formed the basis to a good extent of the Supreme Court ruling, did not bring into question perhaps the ideology that was also a part of that ruling, and the ideology of assimilationism that was also energizing this kind of activity in the court, and has energized the black community for the last 40 years. There is still no effort, from what I can see and hear, on this part to perhaps question the philosophy that thought that black children's self-esteem and black children's love of themselves could be augmented or increased or enhanced by having white people love them. I have always contended that the effort of organizations like the NAACP and others in integrating black children with white children was not principally educational in nature. It was essentially an effort to get over an inferiority complex. I run into too many black parents when, if you would tell them that you know of a black school that was academically more advanced than any white school they could send their children to, will still refuse to send them there. I've known some black families who would send their children to very top-notch black schools in the first grades, and so 2 or 3 or 4 grades, because the schools had a reputation for producing very advanced students. And then after 2 or 3 years or so, take them out of the school and transfer them over to a white school, saying, of course, their children had to learn to get along with everybody. And so what was more important than their continuing to learn in an advanced state was that they learned to relate to white folk, and that they learned somehow to relate to other folk. A great myth, by the way, that is prevalent in the black community. I have yet to see the Japanese busing or plane loading their children to the United States in order for them to learn how to overrun the United States in every aspect of technology and politics and otherwise. I have yet to see the Japanese having to busload or plane load their children to the United States so that their children can outscore American white children on IQ tests and have those IQs grow generation after generation, and that's exactly what has happened, to outthink white children scientifically and technologically, and to outthink them economically and otherwise. I didn't see them exporting their children to American white schools to get that done. Yet we had a group of blacks in this country who felt that 2 plus 2 is not 4 in the black community. 2 plus 2 is only 4 in the suburbs somewhere. 2 plus 2 is 4 in Harlem and anywhere else. The idea that you have to export your child out to learn basic knowledge and information and to enhance itself intellectually is a fallacy. It is a veneer for people who are really trying to solve other problems in their personality. A veneer for people who are really wrestling with their sense of inferiority and self-hatred, who will sell then the idea of trying to get rid of that sense of inferiority, powerlessness, and dependency, sell it in the name of better education, when really the game was trying to be accepted by their former slave masters and the people who currently dominate them. The situation went on. The report went on to say, in the United States, 2/3 of the black children preferred white dolls, a response that researchers interpreted as indicating low racial self-esteem. In the Trinidadian study, that is, they went to Trinidad and replicated the study there as well, 85% of light-skinned black children preferred the white doll, and 64% of dark-skinned black children. Further, it states, the new studies also assess whether an intervention might improve the child's racial pride. After testing the children, the psychologist spent half an hour with the children trying to alter their attitudes. For example, they praised the children who had chosen black dolls and ignored those who chose white dolls. And the children who chose the black dolls were asked to say their dolls had traits such as being pretty, nice, and smart. When the children were then asked the same question in a second test, 2/3 of the black children and 2/3 of the white children as well expressed a preference for the black doll. The idea here, this indicates then that this sense of inferiority can, of course, be educated out of children, and that a correct cultural education will remove, to a good extent, this inferiority complex that has been inculcated in black children. It would indicate then if our children and if we as a people have an inferiority complex, it is one that has been deliberately induced. The article further states the study of children in Trinidad found that the black children there showed an even stronger preference for white dolls than was found in the United States. In the study of 257 children in preschools in Trinidad, Sharon McNichol, a clinical and school psychologist at Creedmoor State Hospital in Queens, found that 3/4 of black children there preferred the black dolls. St. Elmo Gopal, Secretary General of the Trinidad and Tobago Teachers Union, said at a news conference at the annual meeting, even in Trinidad, where 85% of the people are black, we have a black government, we have not recovered from 400 years in which blacks knew the white man as boss. A very interesting statement. Of course, it points out in implication the fact that racism is a global phenomenon. And of course, it speaks to the Eurocentric dominance of the globe itself. And I'll be back to the statement in a moment. Here we see then, after 40-some years from the Kenneth Clark study, about 33 years after the 1954 Supreme Court decision, that our children, and I would also state our people, are still suffering from an inferiority complex. At the time that Justice Jackson is running for president and Judge Marshall is sitting on the Supreme Court and Bluford is flying to the moon somewhere, and McNair, and now a black woman is preparing to go and explore space. at the time that there's been an election of black mayors and other officers across the country, at the time perhaps when there's been an increased number of black faces on our TV sets and various black achievements, we still find as much black inferiority as it was some 40 years ago. This, I think, has serious implications. I think it makes us question whether segregation itself was really the cause of the feeling of inferiority in black children and in black people, as we thought. It'll make us question also what I think was a naive belief, that if we integrated with the whites, somehow they would stop seeing us as people of color or as black people. If we integrated with the whites, somehow the world would stop dividing itself up in terms of race, that somehow the world's division of itself in terms of African people and European people, black people and white people and so forth would somehow end. I think this study clearly implies then that this is not the case. I think it implies on a deeper level that inferiority in black people is a political and social necessity. I often, in speaking to my colleagues and others who are interested in psychology, and of course in the current book that I'm trying to develop now, get across the idea of how black psychology differs, particularly black psychology at this time, differs from Eurocentric psychology. And I think one of the major ways that it differs from Eurocentric psychology is that when we talk about abnormality in the black personality, when we talk about feelings of inferiority in black people, feelings of self-hatred and self-alienation, feelings of incompetence, feelings of powerlessness and so forth that we hear a lot about, we must recognize that these feelings are a political and economic necessity. And we should start from that premise if we are to understand the psychology of black people. I often put it this way. In order for us to be in the state that we are in today as people, we have to be out of our minds. We literally have to be crazy. It is necessary for us to be crazy. It is necessary for us to be backwards. It is necessary for us to be maladjusted. It is necessary for us to be disunited. It is necessary for us to be self-hating. It is necessary for us to be filled with an inferiority complex. In a world where the European is essentially about 10% of the world's population, if that 10% is to continue to rule over the other 90%, it must keep that 90% out of its mind. It must keep that 90% in a state of deception. It must keep that 90% filled with a feeling of powerlessness and incompetence. If this 10% is to continue to consume more than 60% of the world's resources, if this 10% is to continue to rob African, Asian, and other nations of their material wealth, then it must keep those people in a state of maladjustment. And this implies then that no matter how much integration you may bring about, the feeling of inferiority must be a constant in the black personality. No matter how many people you run for president, no matter how many mayors you get elected, no matter how many people you get on the board of IBM and the others, the basic sense of inferiority, the basic sense of dependency must remain a constant in the black mind. And I will indicate this, and I think this study, which occurred now some 40 years later, shows this to be the case. Dr. Clark shows surprise that after all of this time, this feeling is still there. I would not, and I don't think any student who's basically looked at the necessity of black people being out of their minds as being the foundation of European dominance would not be surprised. I think it was quite predictable. Remember, these children have this feeling of inferiority basically from the end of their second years. You can pick up this sense of inferiority as early as 3.5 years old. So it starts very early. And I'm still working through my mind the implications of that finding. We are talking about preschool children, not only children that are in school, but children who are having this feeling prior to school. This would, of course, indicate that, to a degree, that our environment is saturated with racism through TV, through the various media, through the pictures our parents hang on the walls, through the unconscious and conscious state the group has, can influence the child's behavior and attitude starting in the womb itself. And I often start my developmental classes not with the prenatal period and how egg meets sperm, but with why do you have children in the first place? Because the reasons you have children will influence their development. It will influence them from the time they're in your womb until, of course, the day they die upon this earth. It would indicate then that, to a degree and in some way, the black community itself has been induced in helping to bring about a feeling of inferiority in its children. To a good extent, it is not so much the actions of racism that destroy us, the discrimination by white folk and Europeans, the kind of hatred that they express toward us as people that destroys us and gives us an inferiority complex. It is, to a good degree, how we as people react to these actions. Whether we believe the propaganda or not, whether we believe what the European actually has said. We cannot often control the behavior of other people, but we do have a greater control over how we react to that behavior. And to a good extent, the challenge of an Afrocentric education is to educate us in our tendencies to react. To a good extent, it would mean that the actions of racism apparently have induced some of us to accept racist propaganda and to really believe it, to internalize it. Once we internalize the propaganda, then we become social agents for the racists themselves. And to a good extent, then, the black family, once it internalizes the propaganda of Eurocentric racists, becomes a social agent for the racist and begins to produce the kinds of children that the racists want from the time of conception onward. It becomes instructive, you see, to look at a family not as something that just raises children, but a family, to a good extent, is the social agent of the society. It produces the kinds of children that the society says it needs and wants. The family looks out at the opportunity structure, at its own social position. It looks out at what it views as the future for its children, for its group, for its nation, and it inculcates those views into its children and rears its children in terms of those views, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. And in that way, it begins to create the children for the society. In a heavily segregated society, for instance, if your black boy or girl would have said some years ago that they wanted to be president of the United States or that they were going to be president of the United States, how many of us, by being realistic, would have discouraged that view? You know, ain't no black man going to be this or no black woman going to be that. Be real. And in the service of being real, are saying, well, I don't want him to be disappointed. I want to save him from racism and save him from the recognition one day that there are limitations to his aspirations. We quietly steer them toward a trade or a skill. Get this and get a job. So you, what's happening there? While it may have a realistic basis in a certain sort of way, you are also at the same time, though, creating the child's aspirations. You're also creating the child's motivations. You're creating the child's view of itself in line with the way the society is structured. A true Afrocentric family not only relates to its children in terms of reality, but it relates to its children in terms of idealism. It relates in the sense that there is a world that it as an African family and we as an African people want to bring about. While the black man may not be president of the United States, it does not mean that he cannot rule the world. The true Afrocentric family then not only raises its children in terms of the so-called social realities, because it recognizes that social realities are things that men create themselves. And therefore it raises children to create a reality suitable to the advancement and development of black people. But an unconscious black family, an unconscious people, a people who fallen victim to racism, a people who fallen victim to a sense of inferiority, then will produce the kind of inferior children that the white society needs to continue its dominance in the world. And in this way, then, the black family and the black community and black leadership becomes allied with the dominant group and with the Eurocentric group. It is this kind of thing that we must come to become conscious of and to defeat consciously. I'm going to give you a little taste of what I'm writing about in my current book. I want to indicate that black maladjustment is not just a suffering in the soul of black people. It's not just a feeling of inferiority in which over which the individual has to get. It's not just a feeling of alienation that you get over by going to a therapist, that you get over by attending various therapeutic sessions. Black maladjustment is functionally necessary for the world as it is currently constituted. Black maladjustment is a political factor, and I often try to get across to people the understanding that when we go to these universities and these schools, one of the greatest deceptions that's run upon us is the idea that the things that we are taught in these schools are non-political, that they are neutral, that they are somehow universal. And of course, the whites run a beautiful game on us when they, for instance, name their courses without putting their ethnicity in front of them. They don't say white psychology, white education, white economics, white physics, white chemistry, you know. And we often naively then assume because they're called economics, psychology, anthropology, that means we are in a course that has general and universal meanings. And we are made to think that we are odd when we call a course black studies, that there's something wrong with it. But every course in the American college and university and in the American educational establishment is a course in white studies, ladies and gentlemen. And every course in every discipline is designed for essentially the same thing, to maintain white dominance. We must be very conscious of that, and we must recognize that a major part of the education of our children and of ourselves is the fact that we have to politicize the courses that we're taking, even science, even physics and chemistry. So a lot of people think, well, you know, we're talking about atoms and molecules and this and that, and they have no ethnicity and they have no politics. In a fundamental way, you may be right, but on another level, there's a problem with that. Science, scientific thinking, and technological development does not just develop in the head of some genius. It's not the result of some scientific genius who happened to strike upon some major discovery. Scientific discovery and technological development take place within a political social structure. You have to have a political system, a system of social relations, an economic system in order that science and technology develop and flourish. They do not flourish in a vacuum. Therefore, it is not enough just to teach your children physics and chemistry. You must teach them the politics of physics and chemistry. You must teach them the economics of physics and chemistry. You must teach them how a system must organize itself politically and socially such that physical and chemical research take place. It is not enough for us to educate African boys and girls in science and technology so that African can catch up with the Europeans. You will never catch up with the European just by knowing science and technology. Because, ladies and gentlemen, you have to finance technological research. You have to pay scientists to do research. People just don't do research for nothing. If you run the latest physics experiment, you would have to produce a cyclotron with a circumference of some 20 or 30 miles around that costs billions of dollars. And if you're then talking about catching up with the European scientifically, then you must catch up with the European and surpass him, what? Economically. If your children are to work for you and give their scientific genius to the advancement of black people, then we as black people must give them an economic, social, and political foundation in which their gifts can be realized and handed over to us as a people. And therefore, merely to teach chemistry and physics as some neutral subject, as some body of knowledge unrelated to everything else going on into the world, is to be miseducated. That is one of the reasons why we have a country filled, as black people, with chemists, with engineers, machinists, and yet we don't seem to be able to export one gun to South Africa. We don't seem to be able to make one bomb. We have generals and sergeants and Green Berets and Rangers and all of the rest, and yet we are unable to train one guerrilla or anything else to fight for their liberation in this world because there's a lack of social organization. It is not enough just to have knowledge. It is not enough just to have money. Money and knowledge must be organized in order to be effective. And knowledge, in order to flourish and be actualized in some concrete advancement for people, must be based ultimately on social relations between those people. So there must be a social structure. And while your children are learning science and mathematics, they must learn to love themselves and to love one another, and to cooperate one with the other, or else they'll have an Afrocentric mind, but they will still have to go down to IBM and Xerox and do their work. And ultimately then, they will still be racked by a sense of inferiority and dependency. So we must keep that in mind. Let me quickly state here then that the sense of inferiority in black people and the other problems we talk about will not be removed by assimilation. They will not be removed by integration. They will not be removed by Jesse Jackson being elected president of the United States. They will not be removed by the election of other black politicians. And that doesn't say that Jesse Jackson shouldn't be elected, and it doesn't say that other politicians should not be elected. I'm saying, though, we cannot look at those things as being the sole basis for removing and solving the kinds of problems that we have. Because maladjustment is not merely a malady of the individual personality. Maladjustment is functional for a system. That system sometimes can be a family. Do you know sometimes a family is held together by a sick person? It is a scapegoat, a quote-unquote black sheep around which the family defines itself. Sometimes a husband and wife keep the relationship because one of them is sick. And when one goes to the psychiatrist somewhere and try to get better, decide that they're going to change their life, the relationship breaks up. And often families will subtly pull a member back into alcoholism and other kinds of problems as a way of maintaining itself, even though it may be claiming aloud that it's really concerned with getting the person well. Because often the sickness of one individual works to the advantage of another one. And I will say then, when you see a society producing a lot of illness, the illness must be functional for that society. The sick people must be playing a very valuable role in that system. In other words, people don't drive you crazy for nothing. There's some benefit involved. Let me read this section then. The question that often goes unasked or unanswered from a general theoretical point of view is one that's asked, what familial societal role is played by the maladjusted personality? Why are we sick and why do we have the inferiority complex that we have as people? If the maladjusted personality is created and maintained by a social system, whether that system be dyadic, that is a system where there's a relationship between two people, familial or society, then it is reasonable to assume that such a personality, that is the maladjusted personality, is created and maintained because it is needed, because it is essential to the functioning of that system or some segment of that system. The maladjusted personality is created and maintained in service to another. I've often said, of course, one of the problems we have as people is that we are a created people. We are a creation of the Eurocentric Dr. Frankenstein, and we have been created to serve the purpose of Europeans. One of the major goals of an Afrocentric education and of Afrocentric development is that we become self-developing as a people, that we determine what our personality traits will be, that we determine our destiny and our direction, and not be determined by our reactionary relationship to some other people. Often a maladjusted personality is created and maintained in service to parental and familial self-image, to societal, economic, political values and goals. If the maladjusted personality is a defensive and avoidant one, and such defensive and avoidant tendencies are deemed neurotic, then they are created to defend the individual against neurotic demands and to protect it, to help him avoid a reality that is painful. However, that doesn't mean that the individual is not engaged also in serving the society. Often we look at a neurotic person as a defensive personality, as a personality that is avoidant. It seeks to avoid certain responsibilities and certain reactions and certain realities. We must also see, though, that personality in defending itself, in avoiding certain realities, actually serves another group or another person. I was doing a lecture here on self-hatred. And in the very first lecture, I dealt with the image of the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus. And I made the statement that you had to beware of a church such that when you walk into it, the first thing you see is a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus back behind the altar. That church is lying to you, and that church is going to help send you to hell. How did I say that? Because first of all, there's nowhere in the Bible that a description of that Jesus has ever been given. And secondly, that Bible strictly states that graven images should not be made, and it's done. And one minister jumped up, offended because of that statement, and took the statement personally. And I'm a minister in the such and such a church, and I took a course under Dr. Cone at Columbia University, and just laid it all out for me, and objected to it as if I were attacking the minister directly when I was dealing with the concept and I was dealing with the psychology of having gods painted in alien forms and how that induces self-hatred and maintains self-hatred in the people. How praying to a white man is damaging to black people, and how thinking of God as a white man is damaging to black people. I'm dealing with the concept here. Yet she felt a need to defend what she thought of as herself and her profession. But in defending herself, she actually defended the system. She actually defended the status quo. And many of us then, as neurotics, you see, as we engage in our neurotic and maladjusted behavior and defend our egos and defend our vanities and defend our prides, actually support and hold up the system. Parent or justify the abusing family. And how we, in many instances, end up justifying a system that abuses us. Integration itself indicates that, wanting to live and be loved and lay around with people who destroyed us and enslaved us and given us the greatest pain in the world. Sometimes what we call in psychology the love of the aggressor. The people you want to love most are the people who've done the most damage to you. Unhealthy personalities cannot be created by healthy environments. Since the unhealth of an individual or group can result in the relative health, wealth, security, and power and sense of identity of another individual or group, then it serves the interests of the latter group. In other words, the unhealth of the black community serves the health and wealth of the white community. Just as the sickness of the drug addict serves the health and wealth of the pusher. So in a sense then, it becomes in the interest of the pusher to keep the addict, of course, addicted, even though he claims he's doing him a service and a favor. The latter group becomes dependent, that is the unhealthy group, comes to need the unhealthiness, and that is the dominant group really becomes dependent and comes to need the unhealthiness of the former. If the health of the former means a reduction in the dominance of the latter, then the latter resists the health of the former despite its pretensions to the contrary. In other words, when we even see assimilationism, we don't have time to talk about it here tonight, but in many ways assimilationism and integrationism is really another prompt for the maintenance of white power. And while we thought that we bought it in to a great extent, I would argue that to a good extent the white ruling class helped to push it as well, because it also helps to maintain the white ruling class in power. When you have a minority of people, such as the European, often in order to stay in power, they must recruit from the very people they oppress. And therefore they will call up from those people certain talented people or other types who then will identify with their masters and help then to maintain the control over the masses. This often will be called integration and will often be called desegregation. But ultimately, if you look very closely, you'll notice one thing, that the real power relationship between those two groups has not changed. I talk about a number of things we call constants, that if we look closely in the relationship, at the relationship between Europeans and Africans, we will note that there are certain basic things that have not changed despite all of the other things we look at. Despite integrationism, despite political and social change, there are things that are still basically the same and have been the same for the last 400 years. The real power of black people, particularly if you talk about military power, has not changed fundamentally since the very time we met the European. You may find African countries now with jet planes and tanks that they've bought from Europeans, by the way, and still have yet to make. And you may think then that the Africans have entered into a modern era in warfare and so forth, but I would dare say that it's not a single African country that could really protect the interests of black people against European power, particularly as that power moves out into space and can rain down on the African continent bombs and laser weapons and other weapons of various types. and African countries having no anti-ballistic system, no Star Wars system, no system to fight war in space, is literally defenseless. And yet they may fly the latest American jets, and in the face of American and European war power, we are still ultimately defenseless. That has not changed fundamentally in 400 years, ladies and gentlemen. The European economic control of this globe fundamentally has not changed either. The European control of information has not changed fundamentally either. The European control of definition, the definition of reality, the definition of what is and is not, has not changed fundamentally either, and that has been the case for a long time. The European tendency to degrade things African has not changed as well. You may now have a degree in computer technology. You may now have a job that pays you $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, but your fundamental relationship to the European has not changed one whit from the fundamental relationship between our African forefathers and his European slave master. For as you work your computers, you still work to the profits of Europeans. And so the fact that we've moved into the executive offices does not mean we've moved into power. Does not mean that the fundamental power relationship between Europeans and Africans have changed one bit. As a matter of fact, the moving of blacks into the executive offices is an effort to maintain that power and to obscure that power behind a form of neocolonialism. I don't think it is an accident that the desegregation movement and the assimilationist movement in America parallel the neocolonial movement in Africa. As I often tell my classes, you as black students are now being educated to put a black face on white power and to help deceive your people into thinking because you got a job, we have moved forward as a people. Let's then just take a quick look at the functions of maladjustment and why you cannot get blacks, why it is important that blacks never get out of their sickness. You ever wondered why the more social workers you produce, the crazier people get? The more psychologists you produce, the crazier people get? Have you ever wondered about that? I lost a job challenging whites about that. Why you, as a white man, whom these crazy people have permitted to be chairman of the department of predominantly Hispanic and black college, why do you as a white man continue to try to bring these psychologists in here when you know that this psychology is not doing the black and Hispanic community one whit of good? He could not disagree with that. How do you pretend to judge the qualifications of black people for teaching other black people and Hispanic teachers and Hispanic students when you admit every day in the New York educational system that you don't know how to educate black children? We have a group of people who lament about their inability to educate black children, how black children are so-called uncontrollable and ineducable and all of that, and yet they want to sit on a board and determine who is qualified and not qualified. We have this insult downtown where these white dogs are going to try to determine who should be the chancellor of New York City schools, and yet have admitted that they cannot educate black children. And we'll sit there and let them try to lay the foundations and tell us what the credentials of an educator is supposed to be. How do you qualify to tell us what the credentials of an educator is supposed to do? You have not demonstrated that you are capable of educating black people, but yet there are a lot of us who want to sit back and talk about standards and degrees and all this other nonsense that the people who've clearly admitted that they failed have laid upon us. And yet we have a lot of this going on in the system. But this kind of stuff must happen if black people are to continue to be subordinated. How is it functional? The captive African maladjustment justifies European dominance and exploitation. Because we are crazy, because we are criminal, because we are addicts, because we are that, the Europeans have a right to put their police in our community. They have a right to run the welfare agencies that keep us crazy, by the way. They have a right to intrude into our cultural families and personal lives. Why? Because, you see, they are maladjusted. They have learning deficiencies. They have this and that. Therefore, we're coming in to help and treat them in some sort of way. We are bringing in foreign aid. We are calling on the IMF to study and regulate their national economies and so forth. So you will see the so-called sickness and dependency and lagging in development and all of these other kind of things every day are justifications for the Europeans to intrude upon African life and seek to control that life. And when we accept their definitions, we accept their dominance. We ask for their dominance, and we see their dominance as some kind of aid to us. Yet, when we look some 40 years later, we are in the same position or in a worse position than before. How do we solve it? Asking more of it. Well, let's get more degrees. Let's see that the teachers get more degrees. Even though the more degrees they get, the worse the education has become. But what's the solution? Send them back to school for some more. The more money that's been pumped into school, what happens? The worse the education has got. What's the solution? Let's put more money into school. Idiotic solutions all over the place. But you see, you cannot expect a neurotic to think normally. That's the essence of being what? Neurotic. If you thought normally, behaved normally, you wouldn't be a neurotic, would you? So being maladjusted justifies European dominance, rationalizes Eurocentric treatment, as I just said, of African people, and thereby reduces their guilt and self-condemnatory feelings for behaving toward the African in ways contrary to their stated political and constitutional, ethical, moral, religious principles. You know, these great Christians and these great people who believe in equality. How do you believe in equality? You know, the greatest problem in this country was, how do you believe in the equality of man and yet enslave a group of men? How do you believe in this and mistreat and discriminate? In order to get out of that dilemma, then, you must make those people what? Less than men, less than human. You see? So then in that way you can justify what you're doing. They're not fully human. They're not fully men. They're not fully intelligent. They're not fully capable of self-government. They're not fully capable of guiding themselves. Therefore, it's only incumbent on us, those of us who are lucky enough to be more intelligent and divinely sent to rule over men, to take care of them. It is incumbent upon us to take up what? The white man's burden, which happens to be the black man. But actually, the other way around is we have to carry them as a burden. The maladjustment of black people maintains Eurocentric self-esteem, self-definition and identity, self-concept, sense of security, wealth and power, and control. Since the captive African's debilitated state, debased and degraded nature will not permit him to successfully overcome such dominance. The lowest European on the lowest street, Skid Row in this country, can always say one thing: at least I'm not black. He defines himself, and his self-esteem still rests upon the ultimate degradation of black people. So no matter how low and evil he sinks, he still has a superiority attitude toward black people. And therefore the degradation of black people and maintaining black people in that state is important to the European sense of self-esteem and self-identity. The European more or less defines himself in contrast to the African person. Many of you have run into Europeans, and when you came to be what they did not expect to be, you've seen them unravel before your very eyes. When they could not play their accustomed role of dominance and mastery, you've seen them become unglued and unable to function, to become confused. It means then that our submission and subordination and degradation keeps them together. And therefore it is necessary for them to maintain this degraded state in black people in order to maintain their sense of self as a people. And by maintaining us in this debased state and degraded state, they therefore maintain their security, because as long as we think neurotically and maladjustedly, then we will not be able to think in a way that will ultimately defeat them as a people and ultimately destroy them as a people. And remember, we're talking about people who are a minority in the world, and yet who must protect their interest. Black maladjustment induces the captive African to engage in self-defeating behavior, which relieves the Eurocentric establishment of having to impose direct militaristic oppression and to blame the victim for his own predicament. We get plenty of that, of course. In other words, when you get the black maladjusted to a certain degree, he will treat himself. Well, look, I put libraries in your community, you just don't like to read. We have schools here, you just like to drop out for some reason. The knowledge is available to you, you just don't like it for some reason or other. It's a very slick system because it permits then the European to pretend that they are liberal and open and so forth, and yet at the same time maintain themselves. And of course, I often talk about this, the European talks about freedom of speech. But we are only free to speak when our audience does not hear us. We are only free to speak when our audience is not interested. We are only free to speak when the audience really does not listen. Oh, I can sit here and call Reagan all kind of names and talk about white folk. That illustrates what a great system we have here. But how is this possible? To a good extent, it's possible because, you see, at first you induce the audience not to be what? Interested, not to care or to be apathetic, and then you just let the person speak as long as they want to. You induce the audience not to be active, and therefore knowing that after the speech is over, no real activity will take place, so you let them talk as much as they want to. So the system of slavery, you see, and Jim Crowism that occurred shortly thereafter structured the black personality in such a way that despite the Marcus Garveys and the Malcolm X's and other people, there's been relatively little change because the reception often of the audiences was such that they would not threaten the United States after they heard the speech. We are only free in this country to do the wrong thing. Recognize what happened to Farrakhan.